there is your sister class for us.
Oh, yeah, for you. Okay, good. Let's mute ourselves, please. We begin the 5th chapter in Mesilas Yesharim. And now we're going to discuss Beveyor Mafsidei Hazihirus Varachaka Mihem. We're going to discuss the factors which detract from watchfulness and how to avoid them. Okay, we've pretty much discussed what the midah is to know what your derech in life should be and to spend time evaluating, honestly, if you're doing the right things to improve on them and fix them up, and you're doing the wrong things to stay away from them. Lutzado has given us the motivation for the Shleimei Hadas, for the Tchusim and the Amoratzim, so to speak, the Rov Hamonam. And now we're going to discuss those things that stop us from doing it and how you avoid those things from stopping us from doing it. And that's really my intent, is only to go through the first 5 chapters of this Sefer, because the whole point of us being confined in our homes is so that we should be able to have the time to have zehirus. That's what it's all about, to be kovea time for this. And once we finish this chapter, then everyone has to be kovea their own zmanim. That's the idea. If we still are not going to be back in the shul, we'll pick another topic. But this will probably take this week and maybe next week till we'll finish the 5th chapter. So let's begin. Hine, right at the first line, mafsidei hamida hazos, the things that are mafsid, those things that cause you to lose this midah of zehirus, v'hamerchakim, and those things that distance you from the zehirus, heim shlosha, there are 3. I put in red the word mafsidei, which cause you to lose it, and in green I put in merchakeha, things that distance it. What's the difference? Distancing means only temporarily, but losing means complete loss, where you're not doing any zehirus at all. And he says there are 3 of them. So first we'll go through the 3, then we're going to go in detail in each one of the 3. I'm going to spend today and probably tomorrow just working on the first one. The first one is who hatipol v'hatirda ha'olamis, is a person's involvement and preoccupation in worldly affairs. V'hasheni, the second one is haschok v'halotzo, laughter and mockery, mocking things, leitzanut. Hashlishi, and the third one is hachevra hara, bad company. We're going to talk about each one. So we'll start with tipul v'tirda ha'olamis. V'hine, hatipul v'hatirda kvar dibarnu lamal. We've already spoken about the worldly involvement and the preoccupation. We already spoke about this. And again, involvement means the actual involvement in things that you have to do in this world. And the tirda, the preoccupation, means that what you're busy mentally, the mental strain, not the actual work you're doing, but it's on your head. And he says we've already spoken about in the 2nd chapter how the Yetzer Hara weighs this on a person's heart. So they have no other time for zehirus, to contemplate. And that's what he's going to say in a minute, that it's impossible to give thought to what you're doing, whether they're good or bad, because you got everything else on your mind. So that's those things. He explains. Ki bihiyos ha'adam tarud binyanai lama. Since a person is so preoccupied with all the aspects of living in this world, he named machshavosav asuros bezike hamas asher aleim. His thoughts are tied up with the bounds of the weight, that's the burden that's upon him. He's tied down to them. And it's impossible for you to be thinking about the things that you're doing in life, mitzvahs and averos. And that's the main detriment. Your mind is preoccupied. a person, we have a rule that if you're preoccupied with one thing, you really can't put to heart another thing. And that is the worst idea. That's the worst manifestation of Tirdas Olam. You're so busy thinking about Parnasa. You're so busy about all the other things that are things you legitimately have to do in life. And he's going to acknowledge that, but to what extent that is. V'chachamim aleim hasholom, and the rabbis tell us of blessed memory, Birosam said when they saw this danger, Amru, heavy ma'at be'esek, minimize how much involvement you are in this world, va'asuk beTorah, and learn Torah. Kihine, ha'esek muchrach, of course, obtaining a livelihood, you have to be occupied in this world. Well, Tzado is not telling you to go and live in a monastery. No. It's very important. You have to make parnaso. Tzado is not against making parnaso. But too much involvement ain't a muchrach. That's not necessary to such an extent. That the preoccupation is so great. It doesn't leave him any time for his service of Hashem. Therefore, the rabbis tell us that we have to be koveya itim laTorah. We have to establish set times for Torah. And we said those are the main things that brings the heroes. He said that 2 chapters ago. Learning Torah and spending time reflecting on what you've been doing. So again, Shulchan Aruch says you have to be koveya itim laTorah. That means more than one thing. It doesn't only mean you have a fixed time that you learn and you don't give it up, but it means that even let's say you're a person who studies a lot, but when you're studying, how kavua is the studying it itself? When you're learning Torah, do you have your cell phone next to you? So if there's any call, I have to stop right now. I have to pick up this call. I'm not talking about emergencies, but as a general way people do things. I have to go and do this and do that. That's not koveya itim laTorah. And if you're not able to be koveya itim laTorah, there's no room left to correct any of the mistakes that you have. So that's the issue. Number one is that you have to have time to be koveya itim laTorah. We'll talk more about this idea, but that's number one. It has to be, you can't be that busy that you don't have time for Torah. So clearly, Luzzatto acknowledges that a person has to work, and working for a livelihood is fully compatible with spirituality and also with avoiding doing the wrong thing. But if you're way too preoccupied with the work and the business, that doesn't leave you adequate time to think about your derech that you're going, and then that's the person is making a big mistake. He's at fault. If you don't have any time to think, that means everything you're doing is without thinking. Lutzad already said that that's a very dangerous thing. But let's add another point to here to make this a little bit fuller. Besides the fact that when you're so preoccupied with the business world that you don't have time to study Torah and don't have time to reflect, there's another problem with this. You see, the rules of the game of economics differ radically from morality. They differ a lot more. Let me just set this a little closer. I have it way too far away. That's a little better. Okay, so what do we mean? Let's say you avoid doing any averos in business ethics. The criteria for good and bad in economics is much more different than the criteria for things to be good or bad morally. Let me explain. In economics, business, whatever, the bottom line is the most important thing. Profit is good, loss is bad. That's the bottom line. when you're involved day to day trying to make a parnasa. Let's say you go into a venture and you have a lot of thought. You did a lot of market research. You did everything by the book, exactly the way everyone with a PhD in business, that you did everything proper. You took expert advice, solid financing, and yet you still go bankrupt. So what do we say? That was a bad venture. On the other hand, let's say a person starts a business in the most reckless manner with total disregard for sound business principles, and he ends up with a windfall profit. We're going to say that was a good venture. And all of a sudden, the entrepreneur is considered a financial wizard. That's how it is in the business world. When we deal with moral issues, good and bad are determined by intent, by your kavanah, and how and why you chose to do something, and it is not determined by the outcome. So let's give a mashal. Let's say you're a surgeon. Now, I'm not talking about it in Canada, or maybe a little bit in Canada, but in the States, it's a much bigger issue. And let's say you're the surgeon and you decide to do an unnecessary operation on a patient. Don't tell them that, of course, but it's solely because you want to make money. You're a surgeon, you get $300,000 for a surgery, and really the person doesn't need it. He doesn't, but you're not telling him that. You're telling him, oh, you need it, it's a good thing to do, it's very important, but you need it hard to know you're doing it for the money. And let's say while he does the surgery, he just so happens to notice, he totally wasn't expecting it, there was a small cancerous growth that he didn't even expect to find in that surgery. And of course, he takes it out. And now he ends up really saving the patient's life. From the Torah's perspective, he's still an unscrupulous surgeon. He still is a bad guy. But the outcome was amazing. He never planned on that outcome. His plan was to make a lot of money. Let's flip it around. How about on the other hand? A surgeon is faced with a very difficult decision whether to operate on someone or not. And he goes to experts to really know what's the best thing for the patient. And he agonizes over the decision because he wants to do what's for the best patient. And he finally, after all the good, honest advice, he makes the decision to go for the surgery, and the patient does not survive the operation. Would you say it was a good surgeon? Yes. Why? Because intentions were the best, regardless of what the results is. And that's the problem. The problem is that when people are thoroughly immersed in economics and making up a parnasa, they apply the rules of economics to morality, and they can come and measure them the same way and believe that success is morally good and failure is morally bad. And therefore, they've noticed people who amass a lot of wealth, they're idolized, even if they do it in ways that are not the best way. And on the other hand, let's say parents who really devoted themselves selflessly to really raise the best kids they could. And they studied every book on raising children. They worked on their methods of being good parents. They tried their best. And guess what? The child came out as a juvenile delinquent. They could often feel guilty for what they did, although they didn't do anything wrong. That's the problem. If you get too overly involved in making parnasa, in that world of parnasa, you can tend to associate success and failure in spiritual things the same way as it is in parnasa, and that's a major problem that we have to avoid. So that's the first thing he's talking about over here, is that we have to realize that you gotta leave yourself time to study Torah. That is critical. And that will give us time to make cheshbon and nefesh and other things. Now we're going to come to probably one of the biggest powerful points that he makes. I remember I learned to say first time I learned Mesilas Yesharim, I believe when I was 18 years old. So certain memories of when I read it the first, I go, wow. So this for me at least was a wow. Maybe for others it won't be, but for me it was. So let's continue. There's that. And now let's see now. Ki habori yisbarach shemo shebara hayetzer hara b'adam. Hashem created the Yetzer Hara and he put it into the person. That same God who put the Yetzer Hara inside of us, who shebara haTorah tavin lo. He also created the Torah that is the antidote to it. K'mo sham Rizal, as the rabbis say, borasi Yetzer Hara, borasi lo Torah tavin. I have created the Yetzer Hara and I've created the Torah, which is the antidote. So here is the powerful line. V'nei posheru, isn't it obvious? Shim habore lo bara lamaka zu ela refuah zu. If Hashem created for this affliction only this remedy, I underline, it's impossible to be healed from this affliction if you don't use this remedy. Anyone who thinks that he can be saved without the remedy, he's only mistaken. The yira ta'uso lipsof, and he'll only see the mistake at the end, when he will die in his sin. What is he saying? That this person has to address these ideas, these mistaken people. They got to address these ideas because they're very mistaken that they say this is a valid form of Yiddishkeit without studying Torah. They're saying, I can be a good Jew without studying Torah. So he's saying people will see the error only at the end, meaning when they're going to die, but really not, you don't have to wait till he dies. But even as they're getting much older, it's still going to be too late. A person who can live his life and say, you know what? I don't need Torah in my life. The Torah is not the antidote to this. So it's a very foolish thing. It's a very foolish thing. It's going to give more depth to this, but let's just expand on this a little bit over here. For example, look at Moshe. We know in medicine there are certain conditions that are due to certain deficiencies. So there's a sickness called scurvy. Scurvy results from a deficiency of vitamin C. Vitamin C. And nothing will cure scurvy unless you take vitamin C. You could take mega doses of every other vitamin in the world, eat the healthiest foods, but nothing will change until you take vitamin C. Has to be absorbed in, and that will take care of the scurvy. And this is how we have to understand the Torah in terms of the Yetzer Hara. There's no other way to defeat the Yetzer Hara than with Torah. That's all there is to it. And the Torah is, as we'll say, it's a samachayim. It's like a magic. The greatest health food in the world is the Torah. Now, although that's a wonderful mashal, and that's what looks out of something, but there is something we have to add to the mashal because there's something where the mashal falls short. Because you may say, Rabbi, I don't understand you. I've seen many people who study Torah and they're not so wonderful people. I see they have tempers and they have poor midos and they study Torah. They learn daf yomi, learning all kinds of svarim, many hours a day. And they have bad midos and they do many averos and whatever. They study Torah and talk in Shul. How can you understand that? So there has to be one more thing we have to explain where the analogy is not 100%. Vitamin C will help you against the scurvy regardless of how and why it's taken. If, let's say, you make the vitamin C really sweet and it tastes like a candy, and the guy loves candy, and he's taking it not because he wants to cure the scurvy, but he wants to have good candy. Doesn't matter. It's going to work. Let's say when he's sleeping, they have an IV pumped into him. and vitamin C is going into him. It's going to work. It doesn't matter what you're thinking. But Torah does not work that way. Learning Torah is not enough, because there is a tremendous question that the rabbis ask. There is a tremendous question. We learned this statement here that I'm highlighting again. Barasi Yetzirah, Barasi lo Torah top. Okay, I've created Yetzirah, I've created the Torah is the top. Luzzatto is very emphatic. He says, if that's the solution, there is no other solution. He's saying two things. Two things Luzzatto's saying here. The only solution is the Yetzirah. That's the tavlin. That is the medicine. That works. And nothing else will work. Fine. Well, how do you explain another Gemara? And this is how the other Gemara goes. The Gemara goes, La'olam yargiz adam atzmo al Yetzirah. A person should always incite himself against his Yetzirah. If he's successful, fine. But what if he's not? What if the Yetzirah is beating him? So the Gemara says, Yasok b'Torah. Learn Torah. That's what you should do. Now comes a very interesting line. It says, okay, you learn Torah. If you're learning Torah and you're able to overcome the Yetzirah, fine. But if not, then go say the Kriya Shema. Say the Kriya Shema. That'll help you overcome the Yetzirah. If that works, fine. What if that doesn't work? Remember the day of death. Okay. So there's obviously two questions over here. Luzzatto just told us that the only way, Barasi Yetzirah, Barasi Torah Tavlim, it works. The Torah works. How could the other Gemaras say that when your Yetzirah is inciting you, learn Torah and then say, and if it works, fine, and if it doesn't work? What do you mean it doesn't work? It's supposed to work. And Luzzatto goes out on the limb. He's mamish beferish. He's saying it's pasha. There's no other remedy but the Torah. So there's no other remedy but the Torah. How can the other Gemara say that if the Torah doesn't work, then say Shema? Would appear then that Shema is a remedy. And not only Torah. And says if that doesn't work, then remember the day of death. So it seems that's also a remedy. So it comes out we have three remedies. How could Luzzatto say that there's only one remedy? It's the Torah. Okay, if that's the one remedy, how could the remedy not work? And then you tell me it doesn't work, there'll be other remedies that work. This is a very, very famous question. And there's a side question that goes with that. And if you're telling, and it seems from there, that's it. And remembering the day of death, that's going to work. So if it seems that the day of death is foolproof. So why don't we just start with remembering the day of death? Why waste our time with the Torah and Kriya Shema? So there's a very interesting piece from Reb Chaim of Volozhin. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, the premier student of the Vilna Gaon, he writes in his Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, the fourth gate of the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim talks about the incredible value of Torah learning. And while he discusses all the values of Torah learning, he discusses the value of Torah lishma, learning Torah for the sake of learning, which means that when a person, it brings all kinds of sources to that, I'm just getting to the main point, which says that Torah, for it to be authentic Torah, you have to learn it lishma, for its own sake, which means I'm learning Torah to precise for only one reason, to know the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu so that I can do it. That's all. I want to understand Hashem. There's the only way to really get close to Hashem is to understand Hashem as much as we can. And the only way we can understand Hashem is by looking at His Torah. And therefore, I'm studying the Torah because I want to understand the object of my love, which is Hashem. and I want to understand exactly what Hashem wants me to do. And that's the only reason why I'm learning. And that is lishma, for no ulterior motives. And then Reb Chaim of Volozhin says, that is the way Torah should be learned. And now he adds, but not for other motives, such as, it says, lekanter, to use it as a thing to hurt other people by, and also to glorify yourself with it. Don't learn Torah because everyone's saying, wow, he's a big scholar. He is going to be a big Rosh Hashiva one day. Everyone's going to give him respect. And that's why I want to learn Torah. That's not why you're supposed to be learning Torah. Or you're going to learn Torah, it can make you very smart. And you're going to be more holier than thou. And you'll be able to put people down because you're so smart in Torah and show where they're not such good people. You may learn a lot of Torah, but it's not Torah lishma. And here's the golden rule. When the Gemara in Kiddushin says, Barasi Yetzer Hara, Barasi Torah Tavlin, just like we have, I forgot the term, in medicine, you've got the real medicine and you got like the knockoff. I forgot what the term is. You know what I'm talking about. It's not the name brand. It's like a knockoff, or let's even say generic. Yes, generic. Thank you. And let's even say another mushal. You know, sometimes, you want to get certain medications. Some are more legitimate and some of the generics aren't that good even, let's say. So you want Torah, a generic Torah is not going to work. The Torah that's the Tavlin is only Torah that's lishma. When you learn Torah for the sake of learning Torah and for no other ulterior motives, that's the Tavlin, and that will knock out the Yetzer Hara, because the whole Torah you're learning is for the purpose of understanding what Hashem wants, and by definition, you will then have zehirus, and you'll be careful because you want to knock out the Yetzer Hara. But if you're learning Torah for ulterior motives, for arrogance, or to put people down, that's not God's Torah. You're not learning the Torah to really understand the will of God at all, and it will not affect you in the same way. And that's what the Gemara is saying. When the Yetzer Hara comes to you, and it's fighting with you, and you're trying to overcome the Yetzer Hara, and you can't, go learn Torah. So then the Gemara says, and if it works, fine. What does that mean? Because you're learning Torah lishma. And if it doesn't work, then what must it mean? You're not learning Torah lishma. It's not possible that if you're learning Torah, that the Yetzer Hara can get you in such a strong way. So if he's getting you, it means you're not learning Torah lishma for one of two reasons, right? So one is because, you're using it to hurt other people. So we have to do something to fix that. How do you fix it? Say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And really believe what you're saying. There's one God, one Jewish people. We're all one group. Love Hashem. You're going to love Hashem. You're going to love other people. That could take care of one of the problems of this generic type of learning Torah. And if that doesn't work, then maybe there's another problem, the problem of arrogance. You're trying to show off. So you know what you do? Remember the day of death. And if you remember the day of death, you won't be so arrogant. Mm-hmm. What happens in both situations, it will bring the Torah to that of lishma. And once it's pure, authentic prescription drug, it'll work. And why don't we start with the day of death? Now it's very clear why we don't start. The thing of the day of death is very morbid. It's not going to make you love Hashem to think about you're going to die. It's a last resort. If your Torah is not lishma, then you have to do that. So that's the critical point. So the first thing we've understood today is that we cannot be that busy that there's not enough time to study Torah, and to study Torah that is lishma. And Torah that is lishma is Torah that can vanquish the Yetzer Hara. tomorrow we'll talk more about these properties of Torah and how they work in taking care of the Yetzer Hara. So now I'm going to sign off, and we'll do an interesting class about Shavuos that was going to dovetail what we're doing now. So I'm going to be signing off and signing back on momentarily. Have a good night for those of you that are going to be doing other things afterward.
Going to your sister class.
Yes, go ahead, by all means. By all
Thank you. Thank
more
you.
the better. We record everything.
Wonderful.
Okie dokie. Let's just take off the recording. Stop the